Welcome back to Episodes of Kynn. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the truth about being misunderstood and why it happens to almost everyone far more than they realize, usually by people who are completely convinced they've got you figured out. This audio recording includes subtitles, so you can follow along more intentionally and absorb the ideas at your own pace. There's a specific kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with being alone. It's the feeling of being surrounded by people, liked by most of them even, while quietly knowing that the version of you they're responding to isn't quite the real one. Someone calls you confident when you're actually just good at hiding how uncertain you feel. Someone calls you cold when you're actually just careful with people who haven't earned your openness yet. Someone decides you're the strong one, the calm one, the one who's always fine, and slowly you stop bothering to correct it, because correcting it feels exhausting. And somewhere along the way you start wondering if anyone actually knows you at all, or just the character they've decided you're playing. Here's where this starts, and it starts earlier than most people think. Long before you have any control over how you're perceived, other people are already forming a picture of you, and that picture gets built out of very limited information. A handful of moments, a few reactions, a first impression formed in seconds. A quiet kid in a classroom gets labeled shy, and that label follows them for years, even after they've become someone who talks plenty around people they trust. A kid who cried once gets labeled sensitive, and that label calcifies into a permanent trait long after the moment that produced it is forgotten. This is the first thing worth understanding about being misunderstood. It usually doesn't start with someone getting you wrong through malice. It starts with someone getting you wrong through simple, unavoidable incompleteness, and then treating that incomplete picture as finished. Here's the hidden cost of growing up this way, and it shapes people more than they usually notice. Once you've been mislabeled a few times, you learn something uncomfortable, that other people's picture of you can become more powerful than the truth of who you actually are, at least in terms of how they treat you, what they expect from you, and how much room they give you to be anything else. So a lot of people quietly start managing that gap, instead of closing it. You over-explain yourself in an attempt to correct a misconception and get frustrated when the explanation doesn't stick, because people rarely update an impression just because you've asked them to. Or you go the opposite direction and give up on correcting it entirely, letting the inaccurate version of you run the relationship instead, because at least that feels less exhausting than constantly fighting an image that keeps snapping back into place the moment you stop pushing against it. Here's the mechanism underneath all of this. And once you see it, you start noticing it everywhere. People don't actually perceive each other directly. They perceive a mixture of what's actually there and what they expect to find, filtered through their own history, insecurities, and assumptions. Someone who was hurt by someone confident in the past might read your calm as arrogance. Someone who grew up needing to read a room for danger might read your quietness as judgment. Someone who struggles with their own honesty might assume you're hiding something too. In other words, a large part of how you get perceived has very little to do with you specifically, and a lot to do with the lens the other person happens to be looking through. A lens built from their own experiences long before they ever met you. This is why two different people can interact with you in exactly the same way and come away with completely opposite impressions. One experiencing you as warm, the other experiencing the exact same behavior as distant. The variable isn't you, it's them. This explains something that trips a lot of people up, the fact that trying harder to be understood often backfires. When you sense someone has the wrong idea about you, the instinct is to explain yourself more thoroughly, to add detail, context, and clarification until the picture finally corrects itself. But a fixed impression doesn't usually update through more information. It updates, if it updates at all, through repeated experience over time that contradicts it. And even then, people are remarkably good at explaining away contradictory evidence, rather than revising the story they've already settled on. That one time you were cold, they'll remember. The 50 times you were warm afterward quietly get absorbed into the same convenient label, an exception rather than the truth. This is deeply frustrating if you don't understand why it's happening, and it makes a lot of people feel like something is uniquely wrong with them, when really, they've just run into the very ordinary, very universal way human perception works, protecting its first conclusion rather than constantly rebuilding it from scratch. There's a deeper reason this cuts so painfully for so many people, and it has to do with a very old, very human need. The need to be truly known, not just tolerated, liked, or approved of, but actually seen accurately by at least a few people who matter. Being fundamentally misunderstood by everyone touches something close to an identity wound, a fear that maybe there's something about you that simply isn't visible to other people, something too complicated, too internal, or too easily mistaken for something else. And this fear can quietly drive two very different, equally exhausting responses. Some people respond by performing harder, trying to make the accurate version of themselves so obvious and undeniable that misunderstanding becomes impossible. Others respond by withdrawing, deciding it's safer to be politely misunderstood by many than deeply vulnerable in front of anyone. Because vulnerability is exactly what real understanding actually requires, and real understanding, once offered, can also be rejected. Here's what almost nobody tells you about this, though, and it changes the way the whole problem looks once you actually sit with it. Being misunderstood by most people isn't a personal failure. It's a structural inevitability, because full understanding requires far more time, attention, and honesty than almost any relationship actually receives. Most people you interact with, co-workers, acquaintances, even some friends, are operating off a reasonably useful but genuinely incomplete sketch of you. And that's not because they don't care, it's because accurate understanding is expensive, and most relationships simply don't require the full cost of it to function. This means chasing universal understanding is chasing something that was never actually available in the first place. Not because you're too complicated or too hard to read, but because being fully known by everyone was never how human perception was built to work. The real question worth asking, once you accept this, isn't how do I get everyone to see me accurately? It's who actually needs to see me accurately, and am I willing to be vulnerable enough with those specific people to let that happen? Being deeply known is possible, but it's narrow by nature. It requires sustained honesty, repeated contact, and the risk of being disappointing to someone in a way that a polite, surface-level relationship never asks of you. Most people you meet were never going to be candidates for that kind of understanding, and expecting them to get you right anyway is a recipe for constant, low-grade disappointment about something that was never actually on offer. This reframe changes how the frustration of being misunderstood actually feels. Instead of experiencing every inaccurate assumption as evidence that something is wrong with how you come across, you start experiencing most of them as simply the ordinary background noise of being a person that other people only ever partially see, no different from the background noise you produce about them, using your own limited lens, your own history, your own assumptions filling in whatever you don't actually know about them either. The unfairness runs in both directions, all the time, quietly, and once you notice that, it stops feeling personal. None of this means you should stop caring whether the people closest to you understand you accurately. It means being more selective and more honest about where you spend the energy required to be truly seen, instead of spreading that energy thin, trying to correct every inaccurate impression from everyone you encounter. It means accepting a polite, workable misunderstanding from your coworker without it costing you anything internally, while still doing the harder, riskier work of being genuinely known by the small number of people willing to actually look past the label and update it. And it means recognizing that the discomfort of being misread by strangers and acquaintances isn't a sign that you're fundamentally unreadable. It's a sign that you're a full, complicated person interacting with people who, quite reasonably, don't have the time, context, or motivation to see all of that at once. Because the truth about being misunderstood is that it was never really a referendum on how clearly you present yourself. It was always a reflection of how much access any given relationship actually has to who you really are, and most relationships, through no fault of yours, were only ever going to have a little. If any part of this resonated with you, if you've ever felt like the person people describe isn't quite the person you actually are, leave a comment and let me know what stood out. Chances are, you're not the only one who's felt this. Thanks for listening to episodes of Kynn. Take care of your mind, and I'll see you in the next episode.